You're listening to The Observing Eye. Pirate radio for the mind. Coming at you fresh from the computer hell cabin.
Hello, you beautiful lot. It's Friday, the 8th of September 2023, and episode 29 of The Observing Eye. If you're new, welcome aboard. If you're returning, welcome back. As always, I like to begin these episodes with a moment of reflection. So, let's spend a moment considering the good things that have happened to us this past week. And now, a moment for the not so good. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about Imposter Syndrome. Now, this is the first episode that I've done with my new mic setup, so I'm hoping that the audio quality is going to be slightly better than the previous 28. But you let me know, you write in, you tell me if I sound any better than previously. Is there a noticeable difference? I'm hoping so. This rig took a little bit to set up, and you know, I'm enjoying it. It's a nice rig. It's a nice rig. The simple things that make us enjoy life. So imposter syndrome then. We've all had it, haven't we? We've all had imposter syndrome at some point. But in this episode, I want to talk a bit about the definition for it. I want to talk about where it comes, like historically, where the idea of imposter syndrome comes from. We're going to cover the different archetypes that exist within imposter syndrome. And I'm going to throw in some of my thoughts around what I think drives it and whether there are instances where it isn't actually imposter syndrome, but it could be something else. And I'll get to that and we can have a discussion around it in due course. So what is imposter syndrome? So we've all heard the term. It's reverberated through the corridors of our workspaces and colleges and schools for years. It highlights the hidden insecurities that many of us carry. But despite it being such a common phrase that we hear, I feel that there's still a certain amount of misunderstanding around it and certain stereotypes that come along with that. So imposter syndrome, it's a psychological condition, and it's characterized by a persistent doubt in our own abilities and accomplishments, which then becomes accompanied by this fear of being exposed as a fraud. So while those of us with imposter syndrome, we're often really, really good at what we do. We often excel in our fields of expertise, but our success doesn't necessarily bring us satisfaction, but instead a heightened sense of anxiety and self-doubt. So imposter syndrome itself was originally coined in 1978 by two clinical psychologists called Pauline Rose Clance and Suzanne Imes. I hope I'm pronouncing those names correctly. So initially, the research they conducted, it was focused on high-achieving women. But subsequent studies after their initial work have shown that, as I'm sure you expect, imposter syndrome does not discriminate, doesn't care about your gender, ethnicity, or profession. If you got it, you've got it. From a psychological point of view, imposter syndrome is underpinned by what we call cognitive distortions. So that can be things like black and white thinking or the dreaded catastrophizing. I'm sure we've done that, or at very least we know someone who does catastrophize. Now, socioculturally, imposter syndrome can be attributed to systemic issues like gender roles, racial stereotypes, professional hierarchies, all of these things that instigate self-doubt within us. But I guess a question that I was thinking about was, how prevalent is imposter syndrome? Because I don't really feel like we talk about it enough. Because obviously if we talk about it, then we are the fraud. We have to pretend that we don't have it if we do have imposter syndrome. So it makes it a little bit harder to measure the prevalence. But the research, yes, I research, the research that I conducted for this podcast told me that it's very widespread, which I'm not entirely surprised about. And there are various studies that have indicated that approximately 70% of people will experience imposter syndrome at some point in their lives. Now, from a demographic perspective, so who is it impacting? Who does imposter syndrome impact the most? So it was originally thought to predominantly affect women, but studies indicate that it equally affects men. So men are also just as susceptible to it as women, which again, I would entirely expect. I can see why. I can entirely see why in 1978, when we were looking at women, particularly like professional women, high achieving women in the workplace, there was a distinct imposter syndrome around that particular demographic. Because think about the 1978 workspace. Of course it is. Of course it's going to be like that. But I think men would have still felt it back in 1978, but just hidden it more. I think we've come a massive way from when I was a kid back in the 80s to now, where we are talking much more openly about how we are doing mentally and the stuff that's going on with us. I think it's much more socially acceptable for us to be able to say, do you know what, I'm kind of having a hard time with this, or I don't really feel that I'm competent enough to do this. It's still a thing, but I'm hoping that it's more out in the open than it used to be. Now, from an occupational side of things, imposter syndrome is much more prevalent in fields that require constant evaluation and judgment. So that's going to be stuff like academia, it's going to be arts, it's going to be entrepreneurship, it's going to be technology. So those fields that are, have an inherently creative aspect to them and where there is a lot of judgment. Nobody likes being judged, do they? It's dirtiness, dirty judgment. But it's gonna cause that second guessing that goes on with the imposter syndrome. So what have we covered? We've covered the history and the demographics. So let's talk about the mechanisms behind it. All right. And this is where we're going to get into a territory where I'm going to challenge some stuff around imposter syndrome. Okay. But we'll get on to that. I want to give you a bit of an understanding of it first, a bit of a background and some context. So we can work with it a bit better. So imposter syndrome, obviously self-doubt, right? Massive self-doubt, feeling like you're a fraud, feeling like you're an imposter, hence the name. So in these scenarios where we feel imposter syndrome, it's generally because we have what's called a maladaptive attribution style. So I'm going to throw some of my psychology in here because I've not used it in anger for a while, and I really want to get back into it properly. So maladaptive attribution styles. Okay, so in that, what I'm saying is that we are attributing success to luck, to timing, to deception, rather than our competency and our skill to get this done. So instead of us thinking, instead of us being successful at something, to achieving a task, or, being a successful entrepreneur, launching a product, getting a bit of software shipped out on time and it's all working, instead of us attributing that success to our competency, we are putting it down to luck, to external factors, to stuff that's outside of our control. So we feel like, so instead of us being, okay, great, I've accomplished this piece of work, this project, this criteria, and that's, it's worked really well and everyone loves it and it's a success. I'm thinking, if I've got imposter syndrome, fuck me, that was a close shave. Like, all the stars must have aligned for that to work. Fuck knows how that got out the door, and everyone's happy. I'm amazed. Why is everyone happy? This makes no sense. Sound familiar? That's imposter syndrome. That's the mechanism behind it. We are not attributing success to our own competency. We are not valuing our own competency. We are instead putting it down to the universe at large. Okay? Now, there are 6 archetypes associated with imposter syndrome. And when I say archetype, I mean like a character style. So, when you talk about, I don't know if any of you have come across the Jungian archetypes, like the diplomat, the architect, etc. I think there are 16 archetypes within Jungian personality types. We have a similar thing with imposter syndrome. Okay, I'm going to run through those 6, and if you feel that you have imposter syndrome, I think you'll probably know that you have imposter syndrome rather than feel it. See if any of these archetypes align with you. Okay. So the first one is the perfectionist. So this archetype sets unrealistically high standards for themselves. They find it hard to delegate, and they're always aiming to get it just right. Then we have the expert, who are often stuck in paralysis by analysis. I love that phrase, paralysis by analysis. The expert feels that they have to know every single piece of information before making a decision or proceeding forwards. We have the soloist, who prefer to, as the name may suggest, work alone. They see asking for help as a sign of incompetence, which would inherently sideline collaboration, which can also impede personal growth because you're only working from one viewpoint, which is your own, and not, using people as mirrors to reflect things back at you to see where you might be going wrong. We have the natural genius. So this archetype equates competence with ease and speed, and they feel ashamed if a task requires more effort than they had anticipated. It shows a failing on their part in their, maladaptive process going on there. We've got the superhero, characterized by overworking and an inability to say no. Superheroes are inherently prone to burnout because they try to cover all of their insecurities with a flood of accomplishments. And then lastly, the rugged individualist. So this particular archetype believes that accomplishments only count if they have managed every single aspect of that accomplishment alone without any assistance from anyone else whatsoever. Now for me, let's get personal, let's get relatable for a little bit. So I would feel that I could fit into probably all of those archetypes back when I was younger. And when I say younger, I don't mean like a particularly long period of time ago. Maybe like I'm going to say 5 years. So my mid-30s, when I was really hitting the imposter syndrome hard. So yeah, I've experienced imposter syndrome. I feel like pretty much all of the aspects of the imposter syndrome I experienced were definitely around the creative aspect. And when I say creative, so if you've tuned in before, you may have heard me mention, so I work in technology. I do software engineering on the side during the day, and at night I caress the airwaves. But so I feel like my imposter syndrome was all focused around creative stuff, which kind of comes back to what we were saying earlier. So it was the creative writing, it was the building software, because building software is an inherently creative process. It's not, it's not maths and logic, although obviously that's a component of it. Depends what you're doing. But yeah, there's a lot of problem solving, and problem solving is creative. So anything like engineering wise, I would deem as an intensely creative process, anything in that sort of space. So all of my imposter syndrome was around that. And when I think back, I apply a little bit of self-reflection, and I ask myself a question, which is, why did I feel imposter syndrome around these creative things? What was the driving force that fueled my self-doubt? And this is where I'm going to challenge this prevalent use of the idea of imposter syndrome a little bit. So I feel that my imposter syndrome came from a combination of factors. Some of it from when I was younger at school. I think the education system has a lot to answer for when it comes to binding self-worth to success. I think there's a significant thing that can be talked about there, but I'm going to save that for another episode because I'm conscious of time and I want to try and keep these as bite-sized as possible. I think that there's also an issue with, working culture. I think I have worked previously in places where the culture has not been amazing, particularly when I was a lot younger. And I don't feel that they do anything to support self-worth. I think they are essentially an extension of what we experience in the education system, with the whole KPIs and the measurements and the judgment and all that kind of stuff. So I know that didn't help. I think that there was an aspect of myself which was emotionally sensitive and would take things on board perhaps too much. And being introverted, being introspective, I would think about these things too much. And then they would spiral and they would fuel this whole self-doubt, self-worth cataclysm, essentially. What I want to point out here, and this is why I'm going to challenge the imposter syndrome stuff a little bit. I think if we are able to self-reflect and look back and go, okay, I can see that this experience and this experience and this experience, coupled with the way that I am as a person, caused a significant amount of self-doubt and lack of belief in my own competencies, even though all of the facts were telling me that I was doing well at this. The mind refused to acknowledge that fact. It chose a reality of luck and timing and the universe at large. I think that's a valid reason to think that we are experiencing imposter syndrome. There is a significant back history that has left a psychological mark and impacted our perception and behaviors going forwards. So that is imposter syndrome. What is not imposter syndrome, and I think this is where we need to be constantly using self-awareness and reflection. What is not imposter syndrome, for example, is starting a new job, not being aware of the processes that are going on in that job, because they're all going to be different. We all know this. Every job has slightly different processes and ways of doing things. We don't yet know the lay of the land. We don't know the people we need to speak to. We don't know who we can trust and who we can't. That is not imposter syndrome. That is a natural reaction to a new environment. So I think it's important for us to be able to distinguish when we are experiencing imposter syndrome and when we are literally just becoming accustomed and acclimatized to something new. I think that bears considering. We could go into a new relationship and we could have this perception that, oh no, we're not very good at relationships. That's our imposter syndrome. And we could then associate the nervousness and the anxiety of entering into a new relationship with imposter syndrome. When again, it's us acclimatizing to that other person. It's understanding, learning to understand how they tick. What's going on with them internally. Because we've all got these little things, these foibles and niggles and quirks, haven't we? And it's about becoming accustomed to those and accommodating and adaptive around those. So again, that's not you being shit at relationships. That's you trying to adapt to a new scenario. And what I'm saying here is don't be too quick to jump into this categorization. I know we are human beings. We love categorizing things, don't we? Putting things in boxes. So don't be so quick to jump to a categorization. Just accept the experience and exercise a bit of self-compassion. Don't be like, oh, I can't get this immediately, therefore I am shit at it. Zoom out a little bit and look at what's going on. Look at the context of the situation that you're in and remember that it's going to take some time to adjust. It's similar to something I've said previously where people would talk about being depressed and they would confuse depression with just having a bit of a shit moment. And this is in no way my glibly dismissing depression at all. I am familiar with it more than I've talked about on this podcast. because we are having a bad time, a bad period, we're not feeling amazing, that can just be because things are a bit shit and challenging to deal with. It doesn't mean that we are depressed. In the same way that when we go into new scenarios and we are feeling a little bit out of our depth and we don't know what we're doing, we're trying to acclimatize, that doesn't mean we've got imposter syndrome. It means that we are having a normal, natural human reaction to a changing environment. Now, I'm conscious of time. This is probably the longest episode we've done so far, but I just want to touch on some thoughts around overcoming imposter syndrome, okay? So this is, as always, with all things psychological, there is no one-size-fits-all solution to this. There is no quick fix. I'm not going to pretend that there is. None of this stuff is easy or quick to resolve. But from my experience, and what worked for me, is the first thing that I had to do was to get into a space where I'm exercising self-reflection. And I think that's part of any kind of good growth mindset, a good growth process, you know, where we're working on ourselves. We need to look at what's going on internally. We need to step outside of the ego a little bit, outside of what's going on in the mind, and we need to look back at it from a distance. And in doing that, we are able to see the cognitive distortions that are causing us to experience imposter syndrome. Those things that are triggering it. So in my case, it was some of the stuff at school and the education, some of the stuff at work. It was being able to see that, you know, I was sensitive to this and I took things on board more than I probably should have done. And I allowed it to impact my thinking. So it's sort of taking some accountability on some of that stuff as well and owning it, you know. And when we can see this stuff, when we're aware of it, I always say that that's 90% of the battle, is being aware of the stuff that's causing you an issue. Because when we're aware of it, we know what we need to work on. We know what we need to change. So that's the first step, is working on some of that self-reflection stuff. I am not going to go into depth on how you do that, because that would make this podcast like 2 hours long. But I would be happy to create a podcast specifically to discuss that. And maybe that can be our next one, where I talk about working on, you know, building up those tools for self-awareness and self-reflection. So once we know the cognitive distortions, we know what to work on. And then that's step 2. And again, none of this is quick. And none of this is easy. And it's going to be challenging. And there's going to be some really shit emotions that come up for you. And it's going to be really fucking hard work. But the outcome, I assure you, is worth the effort. Once we've got that self-awareness, I like this tool in psychology called Socratic questioning. And I'm sure I've mentioned it in previous podcasts before. But Socratic questioning is where we challenge our perception with reality, with the fact. I shouldn't say reality, because reality is formed by perception, but you know what I mean. So let me give you an example of how we can use Socratic questioning. Okay, so let's say we're a therapist and we've got a client, and a client comes into us and they say, I'm having a really shit time at work. Like, everybody dislikes me. Like, no one's getting on with me. I'm having an awful time with that. So my first question, if I'm going to use Socratic questioning, I want to drill down into the reality of that statement. What's the fact versus what's the person's perception? So I say, right, give me an example of where you've had a bad experience with another member of staff. And they might say, well, Jimmy was really rude to me because I used his coffee cup by mistake and then didn't wash it up. I was like, okay, cool. So you've had an altercation with Jimmy this week. Didn't taste nice. Left you feeling a bit shit. Great. What's the next? Give me another example. Give me another example of that. And the person may go, oh, this Caroline was short with me on Thursday. And okay, you go, okay, right. So we've got Jimmy wasn't happy, used his coffee cup. Caroline was short with you on Thursday. Fine. What's going on with Caroline? Oh, she's dealing with like a really sick relative. Okay, so Caroline's not necessarily being short with you. She's just being short with everyone because she's having a shit time and trying to deal with some stuff. Like, okay, right. So maybe that's not the case. Maybe it's not, we start to see that maybe it's not about me. It's not about my ego. It's about other external things, having empathy for other people and their experiences. And then we drill down into it again. So, okay, so what's another example? And the person goes, oh, I can't think of anything. That's all there is. So they've had a bad experience with Jimmy. It turns out Jimmy's an arsehole anyway. So, Jimmy has a go at everybody. Caroline's got her own shit to deal with. So she's not got time for anyone either. So the perception changes. It ceases to be that these two people are attacking me as an individual. It's that one person's just an arsehole and one person's got some shit going down. So it's not about me. It's about what they're experiencing. It's about their stuff. So then it stops being people are disliking me at work because it turns out it's only 2 instances in the week. And both of those we can get to the bottom of if we step back, look at what's going on and investigate the reasoning behind the behavior of those 2 individuals. So that's Socratic questioning. That's how we challenge our negative mindset, by breaking the perception. And again, once we've broken the perception and we understand the reasoning behind with the fact, not the perception, we understand the fact, then we can push away some of that negative thinking. And that's all I have to say this week. This long episode this week on, I was going to say on cognitive dissonance. No, on imposter syndrome. I'm just thinking that was cognitive dissonance, some of that stuff. So yes, imposter syndrome. That's all I have to say on it. I hope, as always, it has been useful. Much love goes out to my 4 listeners. Thank you for joining me again this week. I appreciate your time and your company. It's Friday, so I'd like to wish you all a wonderful and restful and well-deserved weekend. If you are struggling with imposter syndrome, maybe a little exercise for you over the next few days is to apply a bit of Socratic questioning to your own perceptions and see where that gets you. Maybe ask someone else to question you on it. The observer can't observe itself, right? So get a trusted friend in a safe space to talk to you about it and see what comes up. But just be open. Be open. No one's gonna hate you for it. No one's gonna judge you for it. If they're your friends, if these people care about you, they're gonna want to help. And if they don't, fuck them. They're not worth talking to about it anyway. What do you want people like that in your life for? Have a purge. I think that's another conversation. Anyway, thanks for listening. Much love, and I'll catch you soon.
You've been listening to The Observing Eye. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I hope that you found it useful. And if you're interested in any more of my writings or work around psychology and philosophy and general day-to-day living, please go and take a look at my Substack, which is theobservingeye.substack.com, and that's I as in the letter, not I as in the gelatinous organ through which you see. Take care, everybody. Much love, and I'll see you soon.